All right, good afternoon. Glad to be here to talk to you about cybersecurity and how we're thinking about it in the age of FinTech and digital businesses. So before we get going into some of the challenges and what I see as some of the approaches for how businesses can adapt their cybersecurity program in this age of FinTech and digital business, I first want to set the scene for you in terms of how we're thinking about the overall cybersecurity landscape at JPMorgan Chase. First, we often think of our program as having three main drivers, three things that we have to account for as we design our overall approach to security at the bank. First is clearly the highly dynamic threat environment. You know, it wasn't too long ago that we were not talking about things like destructive attacks or banks being hit and their payments being manipulated via the SWIFT system. Clearly, the threat environment, highly dynamic and changing. Second major driver is the global regulatory environment. You know, for us, we have numerous global regulators around the world who have something to say about cybersecurity and our overall program at the firm. And then finally, the enabling the business agenda, which is where we're going to spend a fair amount of time in this conversation. Whether it's enabling the business from a client and customer expectation standpoint, or it's enabling the business in terms of the platforms and capabilities they want from a digital perspective, and we'll talk about that. At the firm, we have a number of strategic thrusts and themes that we're driving as we think about cybersecurity. I'm really going to touch on two here that you're going to see later on in the talk as well. The first one is this notion of shifting left, which is really the concept of to be able to support a business that it wants to be digital, how do you embed yourself early in the process and not late in the process? And we'll come back to that a little bit later. And the second strategic thrust that I think is relevant for this conversation is the focus on integration and automation. The pace at which the business is going to want to move from a digital standpoint requires us to think about cybersecurity in a way that's more deeply integrated and more of a self-service and automated model if we're going to achieve scale. And I'll come back to that point a little bit later as well. So in terms of how the environment overall has evolved, you know, we used to think that we always had a fair amount of control of our environment because software and systems were inside of our data centers. And there's a number of challenges as we move ahead in this digital business environment. Clearly, first, the emerging technology and the supply chain risks. How do we onboard these companies into our overall ecosystem? And I'll touch on those challenges in just a minute. The second, digital products, services, and assets. We have businesses that want to be more digital enabled, and that is also more of a pace at which they want to operate in terms of adopting capability in the ecosystem. And then third, cloud. Whether it's the private cloud or the public cloud, cloud fundamentally changes how we think about cybersecurity in this overall landscape. So a little bit more detail on some of the challenges. First, the FinTech companies themselves. The FinTech companies, and obviously there's an interrelationship here between the FinTech companies and the cloud and frankly all of these challenges. There is a tight interplay here. The FinTech companies tend to be smaller companies, companies that are cloud native, they are digital native companies, and they don't always necessarily have the expertise that a large financial institution might have from a global regulatory standpoint. Often, those same FinTech companies, necessarily because they are small, may not have the subject matter expertise that's required to think about the totality of controls and security requirements that you may have. Secondly, in terms of the digital products and services, in terms of how the business is now thinking about the client-customer interaction, customers expect to see a frictionless customer experience, one that doesn't have security or controls in the way of them being able to do business. And the myriad of channels that customers and clients want to be able to interact with us on going forward, whether that's things like leveraging voice assistants or now APIs, or really kind of challenging the definition of what a customer or client is. In many cases, in a digital model, clients and customers may have direct API access into your environment. And sort of how do you think about that from a security standpoint and some of the challenges that it raises? And then also, the demand for real-time services, especially as we look at the realm of real-time payments as an example, some of the complexity introduced with fraud, the intersection of digital security and fraud, and how do you handle things like recovery when you have a real-time service that customers actually want. And then finally, in terms of challenges, as we think about the cloud, the expanding and dissolving perimeter. The fact that data and systems and applications are no longer just inside of your data center, but there is an expectation that you have to be able to think about protecting data no matter where the data goes. And it's not just about a third party. In many cases, we're looking at third party, fourth party, fifth party, and I've seen in some cases sixth party relationships. How much insight do you really have into that supply chain, and how are you thinking about your data protection in that sort of environment? I think those are some of the challenges that we have to account for as we think about supporting FinTech and digital business. So enough about the challenges. Here's some thoughts in terms of how we can actually enable the business and adopt these things securely. The first is that it really starts with a business risk appetite, so on the top left, and understanding what the business risk appetite really is. If you want to enable and support FinTech and digital in your business, you have to also understand that that comes along with it some risk. And you have to educate your business and your leadership around what those trade-offs really are. So establishing the business risk appetite, to me, is the most critical first step in terms of adopting emerging technology. The second thing is being prescriptive around the guidance that you provide to these companies. And the reason why I say prescriptive is because what I said before, some of these companies are smaller. They don't have necessarily the depth of expertise that you may have from a regulatory or controls standpoint. And being prescriptive where you can, even better, giving them an API or code where you can. That's even a stronger way to be prescriptive. Clearly, having policies and standards that you share with the emerging technology companies that you're working with. Having a robust third-party oversight program. But as I mentioned earlier, it's really not just about the third parties anymore. Many of the FinTech companies are cloud native. They're running on public cloud providers to start with. And so your third-party program is really about third-party, fourth-party, fifth-party, and beyond oversight. And how do you understand sort of where your data is in the environment? Do you understand how third parties that you work with are leveraging the broader ecosystem? And how are you thinking about that from an overall risk management standpoint? It is really important to have a fast-track process. There are so many solutions and capabilities out there that the business is going to want to be able to leverage. And how do you provide a mechanism to be able to quickly evaluate those companies that meet some baseline set of controls that allows you to experiment and test and see which ones you think have longevity in your environment? But you won't be able to do the full set of controls and evaluation that you want to do. But how do you have a fast-track process that allows you to weed out those that really have no chance, or ones that have a baseline set that you can actually move forward with? And then finally, this notion of tabletop exercises or simulations. And actually, I think this is perhaps one of the most important things. After you've done your controls review and you have an ongoing process for how you manage that in terms of emerging technology, I think perhaps one of the most important things is really how do you think about exercising that and establishing a good working relationship with the FinTech company that you're looking to partner with. Things like, does everyone understand how to interact with each other at a moment where there may be a concern from a security breach kind of standpoint? Are expectations clearly understood? Do people know who to engage and how to engage? And actually running that and actually testing that, I think on a regular basis, is actually quite important in terms of maintaining an effective ecosystem with your FinTech counterparts. But more so than anything, I think it's also the role of global financial institutions to also, they can and they should, share their expertise and their insight, especially when it comes to the regulatory environment and the control environment that we expect when we partner with these companies. So in terms of driving digital business securely, I'll actually start with a little bit of my own story. Before I joined JPMorgan Chase, I was working at a large defense contractor. When I joined the bank, the only thing I knew about banking was checking and savings. That was it. I didn't know anything else about banking. But point number one, in terms of driving a digital business securely, is you must start with understanding the business strategy. And I think for folks in technology and folks in cybersecurity and in controls, you're a much better professional if you have a deep understanding of the business and where it's going and its strategy. That is absolutely critical in terms of supporting a digital business. The second is taking the opportunity to educate the business. Educating the business on what is happening from a threat standpoint. And especially as we look at the intersection between security, digital, and fraud, you can leverage some of what businesses may understand in terms of things like fraud, something that we've all been dealing with for a long time, and how that's evolving from a security and digital standpoint, and use that as an opportunity to educate the business on what's actually happening out there in terms of the overall landscape. Client engagement, I think, is absolutely critical in terms of driving digital business security. In 2016, JPMorgan sponsored a payment controls and fraud survey in which nearly 75% of clients that were surveyed said that they had some form of fraud committed, financial payments related fraud from their particular environment. Nearly 75%. So clearly it's an issue that they're all dealing with. But use that as an opportunity to engage and to have a conversation with the client on something that they are deeply concerned about. It's not just about your particular environment, it's clearly about theirs as well. And then also that transitions into this notion of empowering your clients. How do you actually have client-defined controls? At JPMorgan, we have an excellent partnership between our cybersecurity teams and our business-facing teams. And it led to the creation of things like our wire positive pay, which allows clients to actually look at payments before they settle. But how do you actually empower clients so that they have the controls that they want in a self-service manner? That they can go in and set limits. They can go in and tune their environment and give them the power to control that. So I think it changes the nature of the conversation once you've educated them, but also you empower them from a client control standpoint. Controls as code, another mechanism to enable a digital business. Controls as code basically says that we all know we have security policies and documents, things we expect people to read. We all realize that not everyone actually reads those security policies and documents. And as you're trying to support a business that is moving at pace, you're trying to support the adoption of FinTech and digital, you can do this in a way that's more driven through software and code than it is through paper and documents. All of the controls that we expect from a security standpoint, how do you express those as logic? How do you express those as software? How do you give your developers and your teams APIs which enforce the controls that you want? So that control attestation is not about someone telling you that they did something. Control attestation at that point is simply whether they use the API or not. And it allows you to get to a state where you have control correctness and effectiveness in a streamlined fashion, where developers and other people who are integrating can do that more quickly. So this notion of controls as code, I think, is really important, and it's going to also come back when we talk about the cloud. And I also think the controls as code and really thinking about controls and security as software and data is really sort of the basis of how we think about innovating in the control environment. And looking at emerging technology as a way to solve some systemic problems that we have in the overall ecosystem. So onboarding to the cloud, and as I mentioned earlier, the cloud and FinTech and digital, these things are all obviously interrelated. But definitely here are some thoughts in terms of how to think about onboarding to the cloud environment, whether it's public cloud or a private cloud in your particular environment. The first thing to appreciate is that there is absolutely a model of shared responsibility. The cloud service providers being responsible for security of the cloud, and you being responsible for security of applications and data that you put in the cloud. It's also important to understand how the nature of shared responsibility changes depending on the type of cloud service that you're using. For example, infrastructure as a service, you have more responsibility than the cloud service provider does. Software as a service, the cloud provider, you're dependent more on them from a security standpoint than you have to contribute. So first is really understanding the nature of the shared responsibility model and how does that change depending on the nature of the interaction that you have with cloud service providers. The second thing is recognizing that you can't take your on-premise mindset from a security and control standpoint and try to apply that to the public cloud. So where I see efforts go awry is when you take teams that are used to building security and controls in a data center on-premise and think that that skill set and mindset somehow translates into a completely different paradigm, such as the cloud environment. It doesn't. You have to retool, you have to reskill, you have to think about a different set of training and skills and people to think about security and controls in a cloud environment. And the way that you did things on-prem is not going to be the same way you did things in the cloud. Take, for example, the whole fact that cloud assets are ephemeral. A very simple example being how you deal with vulnerabilities in your on-premise environment and how you patch. Completely different how you might handle that in the cloud, especially when you have a lot more control over what's running in the cloud, what instances, and how do you actually build applications that are resilient to change over time. So it's an example of how you have to change the thinking and mindset when the cloud introduces a completely different way of compute. Automation and infrastructure as code. I think there are two major things that are the most critical from a cloud security standpoint. The first is configuration management, and the second, which I'll come to in a second, is identity and access management. Those two are the linchpin controls that you need to have in a cloud environment. Everything in the cloud environment is simply code and software. And you have a tremendous amount of control over how you can create that environment, instrument the environment, monitor the environment, create and destroy everything that's in the environment. And that's simply software, that's simply configuration in a file. And so as we think about sort of evolving the control environment from on-prem into the cloud environment, that's why I say configuration management becomes really critical. Because the configuration for many things, your entire control environment, your applications, the environment in which they operate, is all defined by lines of code in a configuration file. Identity and access management. The reason why this becomes really important is because you do have to think about identity and access management native to your cloud environment. And you can't, as I said before, necessarily think of this as something where you can leverage only the on-prem approach and mindset that you have in the cloud. But going back to a point I made earlier around shared responsibility, as you move up the stack in the cloud and the public cloud providers, and you take advantage of more and more of the proprietary services and offerings that they have, and you move away from things like infrastructure as a service, and you move more towards some of the functions as a service and some of the software as a service. In those models, identity and access management ends up being perhaps one of the few controls left that you have control over. Because everything else from a shared responsibility model is now the responsibility of the cloud service provider. So the importance of this control becomes really, really critical, and something that you really have to spend a fair amount of time on. And it's also important to understand the ramifications from an identity and access management standpoint. In the on-premise environment, generally speaking, there isn't one set of credentials that gets you access to everything in the environment. In a public cloud environment, that could very much be the case depending on how you built your environment, where you have an account, you have a set of credentials that gets you broad access into the environment. And so while you have more control in the public cloud environment and in the cloud environment in general, you also have to recognize that control comes with a lot more power and responsibility in terms of how you think about it from a security standpoint. Data protection, as I mentioned before, as we're adopting FinTech and cloud companies, the expectation is that financial services companies are thinking about how to protect the data no matter where it resides. How do you have assurances over your data and no matter where that data resides, whether it's a third party, fourth party, or beyond? And do you understand who has access to it? Do you understand how to destroy access to it, for example, revoke access to it? And the entire lifecycle management from a data standpoint is really critical in this cloud construct. And then finally, cloud access security brokers is a way to go deal with onboarding software as a service, as an example. So how do you have different capabilities where you can extend your control environment into the cloud and take advantage of technologies like CASB that allows you to express your policy effectively as code in the cloud and be able to onboard and interact with an ecosystem of software as a service or other companies into your overall environment. So really just some thoughts here in terms of how you can onboard to the cloud safely and securely. Lastly, some final thoughts. The first, as I mentioned before, is that a real key to this is understanding the business strategy. Changing the conversation from security and controls to enabling the business. Understanding where the business is going and how do you actually use the security and controls work that you have to do to enable the business to innovate and to compete. And that's a different conversation with different types of profile of people at the table with your business. The second is making sure that you really think about the pace at which your business is going to want to move with regards to digital and how you retool yourself to focus more on things like self-service and automation that allows you to express your control environment in a way that the business can consume it at a pace that they're going to want to consume it. And that's going to break your traditional model as you move forward. And finally, on the cloud, really embracing the cloud as an opportunity, not running away from it, but embracing it as an opportunity where you can create a foundation that allows your business to innovate and creating the environment where you can actually have more control over what's happening in that environment, not less. And it's an opportunity to really be forward-leaning in that type of environment and not running away from it because it's inevitable and the companies and ecosystem that everyone is working with are already there. And we should be thinking about how to adopt those securely to enable our respective companies. Thank you.